do you have at home? Is it one in every room?
Two in every room.
One on your wrist, timepiece, one in your pocket with your phone. We're very interested, aren't we, in time? This is an interesting chapter about God's time and God's timing that we can explore together. Let's think first of all about Joseph's time in Egypt. We know from chapter 37 and verse 2 that Joseph was 17 when he was taken into Egypt, sold as a slave by his brothers. Chapter 37 verse 2 tells us that Joseph was a young man of 17. And Genesis 41, the next chapter in verse 46, tells us that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So that was 2 years after this event, as we've seen. So there are these 13 years when Joseph is taken as sold as a slave by his brothers, and to when he appears before Pharaoh, 13 years. We're only given one indication of how that's split, and that's at the beginning of chapter 41, when 2 full years had passed. So there's the only actual definite indication. So that takes us up to 11 years. Let's see if we can give some sense of Joseph's time in Egypt. So he's bought by Potiphar, and as we saw last week, he's promoted in stages through Potiphar's household, and God's blessing rests upon Potiphar in his home and in his field. Is that a period of 6 years? He's got to be promoted. That's a gradual process. It's got to be seen of God's blessing resting on all that Potiphar has. Let's say that's around 6 years. And then we're told in chapter 39, verse 7, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph. So that's after that period when Joseph has been promoted. After these things, Potiphar's wife takes this unwanted attention in Joseph. Did that last a year? It may have done, up to a year perhaps, as she pesters him day after day and he's refusing and avoiding her. Well, then he is imprisoned. And as we've seen at the end of the chapter, again, the prison warder recognizes that Joseph is a capable man, and he is entrusted with the care of the other prisoners. Again, that's not going to be immediate. That's going to take time. Perhaps that's another 2 years. And then our chapter begins sometime later. So after Joseph's been established, then the 2 officials are imprisoned. And then halfway through verse 4, after they had been in custody for some time. And that phrase is used of a year or more elsewhere in the Old Testament. So maybe that's another 2 years. So he's imprisoned and it takes care of the prisoners. That's perhaps 2 years. And then these men are brought into custody. And maybe it's after another 2 years when they have their dream. And then he has to wait 2 years for his release. So I'm suggesting that perhaps Joseph was in prison for 6 years. In shackles. Remember, Psalm 105 verse 18 tells us they put him in shackles. And he's in a dungeon. He tells us at the end of verse 15, even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. And that's not just his exaggeration. That's what we're told in the next chapter, verse 14. Pharaoh sent for Joseph and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. It's interesting. It's the same word that was used for the pit or the cistern that his brothers threw him in. Here is Joseph in a pit again. His brothers put him in a pit for no reason. Now he's in another pit for no reason, in the dungeon, as a slave. It's no wonder, is it, that Joseph describes Egypt in chapter 41 and verse 53 as the land of my suffering. 6 years in slavery to Potiphar, perhaps thereabouts. A year, the unwanted attention of his wife. 6 years in prison. That's Joseph's time in Egypt up to this point. No wonder he describes it as the land of my suffering. How time must have dragged for Joseph. That's Joseph's time in Egypt. But then notice in this chapter, God's arranging everything over time. How during this time, and particularly in this chapter, over this period, God is arranging things and putting things in place, weaving things together. Notice what they are. First of all, Joseph is back in Potiphar's good books. Well, why do I say that? Notice in verse 3, Pharaoh put his officials in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Verse 4, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. Who's the captain of the guard? Well, it's not the prison warder. He's the warder of the prison, the captain of the prison. This is the captain of the guard. Chapter 39 and verse 1. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The captain of the guard is Potiphar. Notice again in chapter 40 and verse 7. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, this is Joseph, he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house. Who's his master? Well, chapter 39, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, his master is Potiphar. So it would appear that the prison is part of Potiphar's compound. The prison is in Potiphar's compound, and Joseph, he's back in Potiphar's good books because the captain of the guard assigned the prisoners to Joseph. I think it's interesting, back in chapter 39, verse 19, when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. It doesn't actually say he burned with anger with Joseph, which is how that phrase is normally used. Perhaps he was angry about the whole situation that turned up. Perhaps he was as angry with his wife as he was with Joseph. He recognizes that Joseph is someone he can trust with these important prisoners. So, in God's goodness, Joseph is back in Potiphar's good books to some degree. Pharaoh's officials offend him and are given over to Potiphar's jurisdiction. So the cupbearer, the baker, they offended their master. They sinned against him in some way. We're not told how. And Pharaoh was angry and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Again, it's interesting that the phrase captain of the guard, literally in Hebrew, captain of the executioners. If these men had actually seriously offended Pharaoh, they could have been put to death. But they're not put to death. They're given into the custody of the captain of the guard. They're spared and imprisoned. They are imprisoned with Joseph, and he's assigned to them to serve them. Notice twice we're told that they were put in prison with Joseph. Verse 3, the captain of the guard Pharaoh put them in the custody of the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Verse 7, so he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house. So we're making the point they were with him in that prison alongside him. And not only that, he is assigned to them. Sorry, they are assigned to him so that he can care for them, minister to them, meet their needs. So God brings these two officials into Joseph's remit. They dream meaningful dreams on the same night. Surely God's hand is here, that they have meaningful dreams on the same night. Spurgeon says, dreamland is chaos. What strange romantic things our dreams are. Fragments of this, the broken pieces of that, strangely joined together in absurd fashion. But the hand of the God of order is here, he says. We have to be careful about putting too much emphasis on dreams. Ecclesiastes tells us that they come when there's much business. Our brains are whizzing around, and sometimes our dreams are related to the business of the day. I think as they are in this case, these men dream things appropriate to their lives. God can use dreams. I was reading of the Countess of Huntingdon. She was taking her son to a place to recover. He was ill, and a stranger, a woman, comes up to her in the street and says, "Oh, you've come at last." What? This woman relates that 2 years previously she'd had a dream of a woman dressed exactly as the Countess of Huntingdon was dressed that day. And within 2 weeks, this woman was converted. The Countess of Huntingdon was always a good evangelist. This woman was converted. God may use dreams. Again, Spurgeon says, some people are frightened out of their wits by dreams. He says that's not a bad thing because they're not much good in their wits. God can use dreams, and he uses a dream here. But then also notice Joseph perceives their sadness. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" Joseph wasn't so taken up with his own things, he didn't notice that others were suffering. These men were struggling. They were sad and downcast. Joseph notices that, and they share with him their trouble. "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." They were under no obligation to do that, but Joseph had obviously endeared himself to them enough that they were willing to open their hearts to Joseph. God enables Joseph to interpret the dreams. That's what Joseph clearly says at the end of verse 8. Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" It's not my skill here. God will give the answer if it pleases him. Tell me your dreams. God enables Joseph to interpret their dreams. And as they tell their dreams, Joseph does interpret them. And events unfold exactly as Joseph indicated. And he spells very clearly what will happen. He doesn't spare any of the gruesome details for the baker. Joseph tells things as they are. He doesn't sugarcoat things. He tells things as they are, and things unfold exactly as he indicated. God is arranging all these things over this time. The cupbearer forgets Joseph. God is arranging all these things over all this time. That's part of God's plan. That isn't a mistake, but that's part of God's plan and God's purpose as the story unfolds and as we see. But here is God bringing all these things together in his wise, powerful, and good plan. It's not clear to Joseph at this point. We can see that as we stand back from the story, but Joseph is in the middle of this. Joseph's time in Egypt was a time of suffering. God is arranging things now, though, in this time. And so we see, I think in application, that God's time is the best time. That's what this chapter surely is beginning to indicate to us, that God's time is the best time. I do wonder if Joseph is feeling a bit of self-pity when he relates to the chief cupbearer his dream. Verse 12, this is what it means. Joseph said to him, "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing wrong to deserve being put in prison. There's a lot of me and I there, isn't there? It's interesting, he says to the cupbearer, show me kindness. But what do we read back at the end of chapter 39 and verse 21? The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness. Shouldn't that have been Joseph's first recourse? Lord, will you show me kindness? But now he's looking to a man to show him kindness. It's not surprising that Joseph is feeling a bit of self-pity. There's a very good little article at the moment on the Gospel Coalition website about this seductive sin of self-pity. And in it, the writer quotes John Piper, who points out how actually self-pity is related to pride. John Piper says, boasting is the response of pride to success. Self-pity is the response of pride to suffering. I don't deserve this. Boasting says, I deserve admiration because I have achieved so much. Self-pity says, I deserve admiration because I have suffered so much. Boasting is the voice of pride in the heart of the strong. Self-pity is the voice of pride in the heart of the weak. Boasting sounds self-sufficient. Self-pity sounds self-sacrificing. The writer of the article goes on to say, instead of nursing your wounds by holding a grudge, you must lower yourself to look to the needs of others and respond with joyful service. Abandon the pity party you've thrown for yourself and join the gospel party God calls you to throw for others. To give yourself in service for others. Don't just crab in on yourself in self-pity. Lower yourself and open up yourself to serve others who are also in need. It's not time for Joseph's release. And it's interesting, he asked to be released. I think he says, please mention me to Pharaoh, verse 14, and get me out of this, literally out of this house. Potiphar's house. I don't want to be in this house with this man and this woman anymore. I don't deserve to be a slave. That's what he says, doesn't he? I was forcibly carried off of the land of Egypt. I shouldn't be a slave and I shouldn't be a prisoner. He doesn't want to be released from prison. He wants to be released from slavery and prison. Imagine if that had happened and Joseph was let out and he would make his way home, wouldn't he, to be back with his family. That would be a disaster for the family. You remember someone else tried to hasten things along in the story we've seen in Genesis, Abraham and Sarah. Where's that child? Oh, here's my handmaid Hagar. What a glory that was, a solution. No, that was a mistake. That wasn't God's time. Abraham, you've got to wait. Abraham and Sarah, you've got to wait. Waiting is hard, isn't it? Waiting is hard. Joseph, you've got to wait. You've got to wait another 2 years in these miserable conditions, Joseph. You've got to wait. It's not time yet. Fruit is best ripe, isn't it? If you try to eat fruit when it's unripe, well, it's going to be hard to eat because it's hard. It's not going to taste very nice. It's got no flavor. And it's likely to cause indigestion. Wait till it's ripe. Joseph, wait till the time's right. God's people, wait till the time's right. John Calvin says, we are all taught in the person of Joseph that nothing is more improper than to prescribe the time in which God will help us. To tell God what time he's got to help us, that's wrong. Since he purposely, for a long season, keeps his own people in anxious suspense, that by this very experiment, they may truly know what it is to trust him. God makes us wait so that we can know what it really means to trust him. Again, Matthew Henry says, Joseph perhaps depended too much upon his interest in the chief butler and promised himself too much from him. He learned by his disappointment to trust in God only. We cannot expect too little from man, nor too much from God. So one of Matthew Henry's brilliant sayings, we cannot expect too little from man, nor too much from God. But waiting time is never wasted time. This is not just a blank period. Joseph is learning something in this period. And God teaches his people something in waiting time. It's never wasted time. God is fitting us for his purpose. And Joseph is learning not to put his trust in man, but to put his trust in God. Richard Sibbes, the Puritan, says, therefore, considering that there will be a time, and that God's time is the best time, and that this time will be when he has fitted us, we should learn to wait in any cross or affliction or suffering, and not to be over hasty. We don't like waiting. But sometimes God will make us wait, because he's got to fit us. He's got to change us. He's got to continue his work in us. Perhaps we've got to wait personally. Something in your life that you're chafing at the bit. Well, wait God's time. As a church, there's a need for an elder. We want more people to come. Oh, yes. And God knows our need. And we know that that's a biblical need for plurality of elders, but we've got to wait God's time. The New Testament makes us clear that we're waiting for Christ's return, aren't we? Waiting. We should be waiting. But God has got a purpose in this period of waiting. God knows what he's doing in delaying Christ's coming. And we've got to wait patiently. That's why we began by singing, I waited for the Lord my God and patiently did bear. That's hard. But that's what Joseph learns, and that's what we must learn in God's purpose. God's time is the best time, so wait. May God enable us to do so that his purpose can unfold in his way, at his time, for his glory. Amen. Going to sing John Ryland's song, Sovereign Ruler of the Skies, ever gracious, ever wise. It speaks about times, this hymn does, times of suffering and times of illness and times of wealth and times of poverty, all are in God's hands. It's set to a new setting for this hymn that we'll sing together.